Internet has changed everything, and all of us. It is
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see everyone looking nice and fresh at the end of the day. I wonder why people have stayed back. So, emergence of social media in politics and government. In the past few years, we've witnessed the emergence of social media as a tool to spread information, shape public opinion, challenge governments, and even stir revolutions around the world. Closer home, we have seen how citizens shared information during the horrific blasts in Mumbai, mobilized foot soldiers and public opinion during the anti-corruption movement last year, and led a vocal protest against the apathy in the tragic rape cases and violence against women in India. Our next session will deal with the public aspect of this megalog between government and citizens. In this session, we are fortunate to have with us a champion of free speech and public discourse, who represents the other side of the virtual fence. Through this freewheeling discussion, our aim is to hear what politicians and the government make of social media and if and how they find it a useful tool to communicate and engage. An author, United Nations peacekeeper, refugee worker, human rights activist, Minister of State for HRD, an elected member of the Indian Parliament from Thiruvananthapuram, and a former Minister of State for External Affairs, Dr. Shashi Tharoor straddles several worlds of experience. Dr. Tharoor was the official candidate for India for the post of UN Secretary General in 2006. His UN career began in 1978 when he joined the UN High Commission for Refugees, or the UNHCR, in Geneva. Dr. Tharoor is the award-winning author of more than 13 books and hundreds of articles, op-eds, and book reviews in a wide range of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the International Herald Tribune, Time, Newsweek, and Times of India. He also writes an internationally syndicated monthly column for Project Syndicate. He has authored regular columns for the Indian Express, the Hindu, and the Times of India. Born in London in 1956, believe it or not, everyone who was guessing his age was way off the mark. Born in London in 1956, Dr. Tharoor was educated in India and the US, completing a PhD in 1978 at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. A compelling and effective speaker, he is fluent in English and French, as well as Malayalam and Hindi. And last but not the least, the reason why he's here, of course, is also because he's one of India's most prolific tweeters. So over to you, sir. We're looking forward to a very interesting session, and we'll have some time for Q&A after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deep. And can you hear me at the back? I mean, not that it matters too much. I think in college, I remember we used to begin debates by saying, Mr. Chairman and members of the House. But today I can see it's Mr. Chairman and embers of the House. Hardly anyone left. You've obviously worked them so hard that they really needed their tea break. But anyway, thank you. That's perfect. Anyway, it's good to be here at a Thai event. I go back a very long way with Thai because I was in the States when Thai was founded. And I addressed, I think, the first ever Thai conference in California. And since then, many years, over the last few years, I've had an opportunity to speak to many Thai audiences in places ranging from Kolkata to Kochi. So it's good to be here with Thai, and particularly to speak on the emergence of social media in India in politics and governance. Now, those are all rather loaded terms: social media, politics, governance. They're all, we're told every night, things that India wants to know about. So let me spend a little time describing how I view them, and then we'll talk about how they seem to interact. Now, systems of politics and governance, that is, our political parties, the governments they form, as also the bureaucracy which implements their decisions, can best be described as fairly traditional. In fact, my friend Pratap Bhanu Mehta describes our traditional administrative setup in terms of three features: hierarchy, secrecy, and discretion. Hierarchy is, of course, part of every organization. In the context of political parties and government, particularly in our country, it has some very specific connotations. What it implies is a clear vertical structure, where authority flows from the top down and accountability flows vertically upwards. So directions and directives will originate in the high command, if I can use a phrase, be relayed down to the rank and file. In turn, each person taking an action expects to be accountable for it, primarily to their superior, rather than to the people they're supposed to be affecting with their actions. Secrecy is, of course, only to a limited extent meant to be construed literally, to mean that the government keeps secrets. Anyway, no one shared any with me. But it does refer, however, to the asymmetry in access to information, not just for anyone outside the system, but even for someone that's part of the government seeking information on what another part of the government is doing. It's fairly typical of our system for coteries to exist which jealously guard the privilege of access to both information and decision makers. We have, in other words, a system that presents barriers to the flow of information, and in which the existence and the exercise of power is often closely related to the presence of such barriers. And then discretion, in both senses of that word, goes closely with these structures of vertical accountability and power, stemming from access to information. So there's the obligation to maintain discretion about one's work, rather than to promote transparency. In any traditional structure, that's the way it tends to be. Some amount of discretionary power, to use the other meaning of the word discretion, vests in a functionary. He or she may choose to do something that is asked of them, and for the most part, they would expect to have to justify themselves to their superiors, if indeed they feel any obligation to justify themselves at all. Now, social media, unsurprisingly, poses a number of challenges to such traditional setups. This could broadly be said of the new media atmosphere generally, in which we find ourselves. Technology has become the biggest asset for those who seek to promote and protect freedom of information around the world. And the exciting thing about social media is that it offers great possibilities for enhancing traditional media and combining them with new media. After all, even the internet has been made possible by advances in technology that have had similar transformational effects on traditional media. Take radio and television, for example. They still remain the sole form of access to the information society for much of the world's population, including the very poor and the illiterate, but even the rest of us continue to rely on them to a greater or lesser extent. What we can see today, and it's an exciting development, is increasing convergence between or amongst television, radio, the internet, and mobile telephony. And these technologies are already interacting in ways that promise to transform how we interact with information, with each other, and with the wider world. All of this adds up to a truly democratic media, which thrives upon the free flow of information. This is almost by definition a challenge to the power base of actors entrenched in the traditional system. It's not as if each of us has not adapted to the new technology. We do so sooner or later to a greater or lesser degree, but our traditional model has obviously been strained to the breaking point. And it comes, of course, at a time when the information era has also accentuated the sense of rights and entitlement in a democracy that the common citizen feels, and therefore the pressure for transparency and accountability to the common citizen. Now, this is obviously also a generational thing. You've got the youth of our country who have taken to social media with tremendous gusto. The overwhelming majority of Indians on social media sites, social networking sites, is below the age of 25. We have over 220 million Indians between the ages of 10 and 19 alone. And they represent, increasingly, because some of them don't yet have access to the internet, but though we want, as a government, to provide internet access throughout the country, they represent a cohort that has grown up viewing information and communication technology as a natural and established part of their world and their life. This segment is also the core of our much proclaimed demographic dividend. It can shape our nation's future. Their ideas of what is natural, normal, or expected may well derive from or resonate from their experiences of social media, rather than with any interaction in the traditional system. Now, the world of commerce and industry has not lagged behind. Mobile-based sales, for example, are growing rapidly in India today. I was reading an article in the Mint which estimates that over 150 billion US dollars of purchases have been influenced by the internet. Influence in the sense that either they involve direct purchase online, or were a result of online advertising, or were researched online, and so on. So this means there's going to be, in terms of other aspects of daily life, an increasingly e-savvy young middle class, which of course will be the stuff of politics and governance in our country as well. Now the fields of government policy, governance, politics, all of these have been slower on the uptake for the reasons I've already described, and perhaps also because they differ from the field of information and communication technology in another respect. That is, a change for them has always been a gradual and incremental process. Where the two fields have intersected, we have seen that it's technology that sets the pace. But the traditional model that I summarized at the beginning of my remarks is in many, many ways what influences the purposes for and the manner in which that technology is adapted by government and politicians. So the traditional model can see new media and social media, for example, as principally a new system of broadcast. It can be used as a means for delivering services. It can also perhaps be used as a tool for surveillance on persons or areas of concern. All of this, though, is one-way communication. It does not speak to the true power of this democratic medium, which is, of course, to operate a real-time feedback mechanism. And it has no concept, no strategy for social media as a tool to express outrage, which is, of course, the part of social media that I tend to see much more of. Now, that said, the political space continues to embrace social media at an accelerating pace. To illustrate, in September last year, the Economic Times carried an article to the effect that for all the hype surrounding social media, most young politicians were not even active on any social networking site. Few ministers or MPs maintained any social media account. Many of those accounts only saw sporadic and uninteresting updates. Of course, none of these criticisms I hope was ever leveled at me. But in that article last September, Pratish Nandi, who was interviewed, remarked that even he had more followers than the Prime Minister on Twitter. He had, at that point, 225,000 to the PM's 195,000 or so at that time. Others interviewed in the article made it clear that they had no intention of adopting social media in the near future. Now that's September 2012, right? 7 months ago. Today, what are we seeing? Just in these 7 months, the changes. The finance minister speaks to people about the budget, not just on television, but on a Google Hangout. The planning commission participates in one of these. My friend and fellow minister, Mr. C.P. Joshi, the Minister for Road Transport and Highways, a very traditional infrastructure ministry, does a Google Hangout. In fact, I myself will be doing one in a couple of weeks about human resource development. The change was so remarkable and so rapid that even the BBC reported it on the day of Mr. Chidambaram's hangout. Now, the 12% of India's population, which is the extent of our internet penetration today, is actually already sufficient to make us the world's third largest internet market. And it's also the fastest growing for our size. We are estimated to overtake the US in terms of the number of persons online by 2020, which is not that far away. Look at the extraordinary transformation that is happening, as I mentioned. Just a day after he was sworn in as our president, Pranab Mukherjee, many would think of as a very traditional old-style politician, announced that he'd be opening a Facebook account to receive and respond to the queries from the public. But in fact, his fellow Bengali, Mamata Banerjee, had actually beaten him to it with a popular and widely read website that the media continues to mine daily for news stories about her views. In fact, there's one today, I believe, in the papers. Just 3 years ago, when I first went on social media, it was fashionable for Indian politicians to sneer at the use of social media. I remember the then president of the BJP, Mr. Venkaiah Naidu, saying too much tweeting can lead to quitting. Of course, he was quite prescient in my case, but that's another matter. Then our own president has now made it clear that these are essential tools for clear, accountable, and credible political leadership. And at this year's January Chintan Shivir of the AICC in Jaipur, we have many congressmen urging that the party and its members build an effective social media presence. I suppose I was the first government official in India who engaged with the general public online on Twitter, though in all fairness, L.K. Advani's web page had already created a lot of buzz during the last elections. More and more politicians are online today, including Sushma Swaraj, Narendra Modi of the BJP, Digvijay Singh, Anil Shastri, Naveen Jindal, Manish Tiwari, Hamdullah Saeed of the Congress, and many, many more. Politicians are issuing their own bulletins, actually answering individual questions online. Now, sometimes this creates its own challenges. In fact, the leader of the opposition, Sushma Swaraj, has already blamed Twitter's 140-character limit for an imprecisely worded message about the Prime Minister that had created political ripples within the BJP. Now, of course, there is usually the safety net that politicians can always type, delete, and retype before pressing enter. But Ms. Swaraj reportedly dictates her Twitter messages, so perhaps that's a little more difficult for her. Today, nearly half the Council of Ministers is online. I welcome many of them, as also the Planning Commission, when they joined. And I've always been amused when people who in the past looked askance at my tweeting, even urged me to give up Twitter many times, are now begging me to retweet them so they can attract more eyeballs. More and more government offices are also setting up a social media presence. Political issues are being raised and debated regularly and boisterously in the social media space. And the Prime Minister's account, since Pratish Nandi mentioned it, has more than doubled its following to over 4.7 lakhs as of March. But there are pitfalls. And politicians are obviously more aware of these pitfalls than I was when I started. For example, there's the ever-present risk that something said on a social network can be taken out of context or misused by our critics. This is particularly challenging when you attempt, unwisely in the Indian political space, to use humor. Some of you will remember how I was asked by a journalist during our austerity drive, Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class? And since I'd lived in the West for 30 years, where it's a very routine, banal expression for economy class, and that too not aiming at the passengers, but at the airlines, for herding us all in like cattle, I said yes, in cattle class out of solidarity with all our holy cows. Now, this might have seemed innocent. I went off to Liberia and was completely unaware of the national furor that erupted for more than 2 days as people denounced me for sneering at our public. Senior politicians called for my resignation. The whole thing was unbelievably out of control. And then, of course, when it got translated into Malayalam and Hindi and Gujarati and so on, it became 10 times worse. And to this day, I will lose votes because people think that I demean them all as animals. I mean, this is the danger in a multilingual polity, which frankly, I think we need to be aware of, and people are much more conscious of today. I was the unwitting pioneer who wasn't sufficiently conscious of that risk when I tweeted, and that too using a phrase that had been used in the question. But you know, Shakespeare said it 300 years ago, 400 years ago, that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. And the fact is that on a social media network, you can't just think of what you intended to convey. You have to always worry about what is understood by those at the receiving end. Another pitfall has been the danger of deliberate distortion and malice. This is, of course, one more example of it, but about a year and a half ago, I think, well-wishers urged Jammu and Kashmir Chief Minister Omar Abdullah, who was an assiduous tweeter, to delete a light-hearted remark that he made that could have been maliciously distorted by his political enemies. So he did so, with the curious result that the advice to delete could still be found on Twitter, but the actual offending remark itself has long since disappeared. So there you've got a fail-safe mechanism. Responses to questions are particularly vulnerable to being issued in haste and without the usual sort of more careful vetting that more formal statements by government undergo. The nature of social networking calls for speedy issuance of information and instant reaction, neither of which, as you know, government processes in our country are really designed for. My own experience with Twitter has, as I've suggested already, had its own positives and negatives. But in my view, the positives outweigh the negatives. It is, after all, an interactive broadcast medium, an interactive Akashwani. With one message today, I can reach more than 1.7 million people, 17 lakhs, an audience no politician would disdain. That number still keeps increasing every day. And as I discovered during my first stint in government, I was also able to use it to put out information that the mainstream media was simply not interested in. For example, my visit to Liberia, which was the first visit by any Indian minister to that country, not counting a 3-hour visit 38 years earlier by a minister, was completely ignored by the mainstream media in India. But through my updates, through links I posted on Twitter and so on, India's Africa diplomacy got a little more widely known, at least to those who were interested in following this on Twitter. Similarly, when I cut short, I detoured from a trip in Latin America to go to Haiti and became one of the first foreign leaders to visit that country in the aftermath of their devastating earthquake. Again, zero coverage in India except through my Twitter feed. So it becomes a way of compensating for the limitations of the mainstream media. Another example, a girl from my constituency who was amputated in both legs after a railway accident got offers of help from around the world when I tweeted about her plight on Twitter. So using social media to actually bypass the mainstream media, at the same time to make people aware of the daily life of a minister, sensitize them, demystify some of the challenges of governance. All of this, frankly, I think is a justification for politicians and government officials to be on Twitter. And of course, all over the world, this is the practice. President Obama has millions of followers on Twitter. Hillary Clinton, when she came to India on an official visit, was updating her program literally every day, 9-10 times a day with Twitter feeds. The UK government now encourages frequent use of Twitter, even issues guidelines to their officials on effective tweeting. In fact, the new British High Commissioner told me that he'd been instructed to open a Twitter account, and he was bracing himself to do so after his summer holidays last year. He's now on Twitter. Former Australian Prime Minister, Canada's Leader of the Opposition, a whole slew of foreign ministers, some of which I'm proud to say, some of whom announced that they were inspired by me in doing so. A lot of this is happening now on Twitter around the world. And in my view, a democratic politician in India should not resist a new communications medium. Sure, the name Twitter might itself put you off, as it did many people. It led many to suggest when I first started that it's not a suitable medium for a serious politician, an attitude that, of course, was reinforced by the mainstream media, which was deeply resentful initially of social media. But then I think people have come to realize that even Google and Yahoo are slightly silly names, which have now become household words, and the same will apply to Twitter. And that indeed, I remember saying in an interview when I was being widely attacked for tweeting in late 2009, I said, look, I'm convinced that a large number of Indian politicians will be on Twitter 10 years from now. And sure, I didn't have to wait that long to see a rather significant number of Indian politicians now on social media within 3 years of my giving that interview. I'm conscious, of course, that those who are ahead of the curve in any field are rarely appreciated. But in any case, the point is that it was worth doing and it remains worth doing. But Twitter is only a vehicle. The message is the issue and not the medium. I believe that many politicians increasingly understand that what I'm doing brings into the party's ambit a large number of people who would otherwise be indifferent to politics and the Congress. I just need to take care to ensure that the message is not misunderstood. Now, there have been some interesting studies of the role of social media now in our country. There was an input that I saw from the IRIS Knowledge Foundation and the Internet and Mobile Association of India, perhaps some of you are familiar with it, which has actually gone so far as to argue that there are as many as 160 constituencies where the margin of victory is smaller than the number of constituents on social media, or where over 10% of the population is on social media. So it estimates that by the next election, as many as 80 million Indians may be using social media, and it asserts that it's a constituency that no politician can afford to ignore. Now, the study is perhaps fairly simplistic, and you can't just draw correlations as easily as all that, but it points to the increasing political power of social media, particularly in reaching out to young voters, many of whom have grown up much more comfortable in the social media space than any earlier generation. Now, obviously, at the same time, I don't believe that any election is going to be won or lost on social media alone. That may be true in the United States. It's simply not true anywhere else yet. And certainly in India, you're never going to organize a rally or do a get-out-the-vote drive on social media. You'll get 10 or 12% at best. And in most of our constituencies, less than that, because this average is a result of a very heavy concentration in our big cities. There are issues of governance and provision of services that, of course, continue to strike an important chord far beyond the number of persons that you can influence through social media. But it's important to recognize the value of this as a platform for debate and discussion, and of course, real-time informed interaction. I even, in my last election, where I had a very active website, I knew that perhaps not even 2 or 3% of my voters were seeing the website, but I kept directing the mainstream media to it. Look, if you can't catch me when I'm busy campaigning, go on my website, you'll get your answer. And so I found that the website became a tool to reach a majority of voters through traditional media, which had access to the internet. Governance. Governance is also adapted increasingly to the electronic age. The ways in which our state engages with its citizens is bound to alter, of course, the functioning of government agencies. I'll give you just 3 examples. India Post enables you to track your speed-posted letters on their website all the way to its destination. New Delhi Police provides contact details for every senior officer and the means to view an FIR and request a copy online. The Pune Municipal Corporation advises citizens on garbage disposal practices on Twitter. Technology is rendering the actions of the state more and more transparent. No longer can any agent of state authority, whether a bureaucrat or an elected representative, hide in the labyrinthine maze of secret rules, records, procedures, and of course, with the Right to Information Act and the widespread availability of government data, access to both new and traditional mediums have armed citizens with powerful tools to question the way government is conducted. No surprise then that today's informed and impatient citizenry demands an effective service from the state. Now, the government of India is moving very much in the right direction on this. In order to improve the overall quality of government services, as well as improving in-house practices and functioning. We started, by the way, as early as the mid-80s. India was one of the first governments under Rajiv Gandhi, who in '85 decided to increase the pace of the use of ICT in the day-to-day business of governance. And we've moved early on into the areas of digital governance and e-governance. The National Informatics Center Network, NICNet, connected district level and rural government offices to government secretariats in the state capitals, and was in turn connected to the national network in Delhi, going back, as I say, to the late 80s. In 2000, the Information Technology, or IT Act, provided legal recognition for digital signatures in order to crystallize e-commerce, submission of your income tax returns, and so on. Those involve the use of alternatives to paper-based methods of communication, as well as storage of information, so electronic filing of documents happened. And then, of course, in the IT Policy Amendment Act of 2008, digital signatures became referred to as electronic signatures. But if you go back to 1995, under the National E-Governance Plan that was launched at that time, the government of India already moved towards automating the provision of services across all government departments. Right now, we have pending a bill in Parliament, if Parliament is ever going to be allowed to do its work, called the Electronic Delivery of Services Bill, which was introduced in 2011, and that will make the provision of services electronically mandatory across all government departments and ministries. So it's no longer just a question of computerizing government departments. There are scattered initiatives all over the place aimed at speeding up e-governance implementation across the varying arms of the government. And these fragmented initiatives are being unified into a common vision and strategy. I don't know how many of you have seen the National E-Governance Plan, which was issued in 2006, but it already takes a holistic view of e-governance initiatives across the country, integrating them into a collective vision, making it a shared cause, and we are trying to create a massive countrywide infrastructure, including broadband in every village, that will actually reach the most remotest of our villages, creating large-scale digitization of government records, and creating, therefore, an opportunity for us to use the internet to improve our e-governance. The NEGP, the National E-Governance Plan, has the potential also to enable huge savings in costs through the sharing of core and support infrastructure, interoperability, setting common standards, and presenting increasingly seamless views of government to the citizens. And of course, the idea is to bring public services closer to ordinary citizens, also reduce corruption. For example, just the computerization of land records in a few places, a few states, has dramatically reduced the corruption possibilities of the local patwari who used to control what was available to citizens of land records. We may not be able to go as far as Finland, which recently amended their constitution to make broadband internet a fundamental human right in their country, but we certainly aim to take broadband much farther in the years to come. Now, there's some interesting things, by the way, that go beyond just social media networking, and though I'm supposed to speak about social media, I'm going to try and add this point as well, because we are talking about politics and governance, and there was a very interesting experiment last year in the state assembly elections in Manipur, where technology has actually transformed the process of electioneering. For example, the Election Commission of India, which has always been concerned about monitoring elections, particularly in remote areas, not only tried this out in Manipur with great success, but now wants to expand it to all difficult areas in our country. What was it? Electoral officers in Manipur, armed with cheap camera phones, right, just like the ones we've all got in our pockets, but with a 3-day-long battery life, since they were often on duty in areas lacking electricity, took photographs of each person coming into a booth to cast their vote on election day. This database was to be used to identify and rule out duplicates. Now, this would normally have been a very long and cumbersome process, but then one of the staff realized that Google's free-to-download Picasa software could be customized for face recognition. So they began to match the faces of people who voted against the photos matched on the electoral rolls. And of course, you could see somebody who had voted twice or tried to vote twice. So from approximately 12 lakh voters photographed in Manipur, over 20,000 cases of duplication, multiple voting or fake identities were detected and disqualified. Now, the electoral officer responsible for this brainchild, Narem Praveen Singh, mentioned in an interview in the Times of India that he was certain the electoral rolls would be 100% accurate by the next election in Manipur. His team is already going out, guided by census and electoral data, to photograph the eligible 4 lakh voters who did not cast their votes in the state elections, so their database is complete. So whether you voted or not, now your picture is going to be in the Election Commission database. A simple, frugal innovation, right? Cheap mobile phones, free software, and the efforts of a few diligent officers have successfully resolved a very serious problem that has dogged the conduct of elections in so many parts of our chaotic democracy. So there is a use of technology going beyond social media, but if you like, internet technology, communications technology in the political and governance space of our country. One more thought. Looking at the state of public discourse in India and getting back to social media in particular, it seems almost as if we're living in some sort of Indian age of Robespierre, where every public institution and every public individual faces an ordeal by media en route to the inevitable fate of being guillotined in public. One concern, therefore, that has led to the state attempting to regulate the internet and of course, immediate outcries that this is a threat to free speech. Now, as Deep Kalra was kind enough to mention at the beginning, I've long been an advocate for free, open and informed debate. And as far as I'm concerned, I do not want there to be any kind of political censorship on social media. I certainly have publicly expressed my reservations about the potential for misuse of certain provisions in the law, like Section 66A of the IT Act and so on. And of course, ours is not a government that has ever believed in media censorship. What the government has been concerned about has been the use or misuse of social media networking to incite hatred and communal violence, which of course is illegal anyway. And Kapil Sibal, who has been so unfairly attacked on this, our Minister for ICT, has publicly avowed at the Google Big Tent event, where I also spoke last month, that we shall do nothing to diminish the freedom of expression. Now, the fact is that every society, of course, has to find its own sensible restraints on how that freedom is to be exercised. We have the famous line by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the US that freedom of expression does not extend to the right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater, because the consequences of that shouting outweigh the positive benefits of asserting your freedom of speech. All societies vary in their cultural and political traditions. The boundaries therefore vary from place to place. Free speech absolutists like to pretend that anything can be said by anybody, but the fact is that if not law, then at least convention prevails even in Western democracies. For example, no American editor would allow the N-word to be used to describe black Americans. Not because it's against the law, but because it would cause such offense as to be unacceptable to use. Or just as the commonplace practice of women taking off their bikini tops in Saint-Tropez, Copacabana, or Bondi Beach could not be replicated on the beaches of Goa, Dubai, or Karachi without inciting a riot or risking assault or arrest, so also things can be said in the former sets of places that can't be said in the latter. It's no use pretending that such differences of culture and politics and sensitivity don't exist. They do. And they're the reason why free speech in, say, Sweden is not the same as free speech in Singapore. And why sometimes a government, in worrying about people using free speech like a lit match at a petrol pump, would rather snuff out the match than close down the pump, which is precisely what specific targeted actions are sometimes trying to do. Now, there are so many examples, and I really want to leave time for questions and answers, so I'm going to skip some of them. I think many of you will remember the efforts that have been made. Everything from the arrest of those poor girls for a Facebook post and a like, to the successful attempt by IIPM to go to a court and ban various websites that criticized it, including a UGC website that simply stated factually that IIPM was not a recognized institution. So you've got some very interesting evolving challenges right now in this whole area. But no one can suggest that this is some sort of Wild West frontier land, the internet, where no laws apply. Laws have to apply. And just as crime, cheating, theft is illegal in real life on the street and also on the internet, there is no reason why incitement to hatred, incitement to violence, abuse of people's personal, religious, and other sensitivities should not, if not be criminalized, at least be restrained by appropriate legislation and appropriate practice. Now, this is still evolving, and I'm not suggesting that anyone, including the government, has absolute answers in all of this. But the truth is that we're living in an age in which even the old 24/7 news cycle seems like an outdated phrase, because the news cycle can be a matter of minutes or even seconds now, thanks to media like Twitter. You know, when the Osama bin Laden raid happened, one guy was tweeting live as the helicopters were coming in, because he saw these helicopters coming into Abbottabad. There's no question of trying to manage media stories afterwards. Even in relatively repressive societies. I mean, there was that controversy in Iran over the election of, the disputed election of Ahmadinejad. They managed to curb all the protests and the mainstream media, but they couldn't curb the social media, and Twitter kept the protests alive for weeks after the Iranian government thought they would normally have won. The Arab Spring, the role of social media there. I actually come out not totally convinced it was only social media. I think good old SMSs had a major role in actually pulling people together in Tahrir Square, but still social media had a tremendously multiplying effect, and you're going to hear about that from the absolute expert just shortly after this panel. And there are, of course, governments doing far, far, far worse than anything that Iran might have done or India would ever even contemplate. You've got the Great Firewall of China, as it's often referred to. China employs 40,000 cyber police to just monitor everything that's posted on the web in China. They've restricted Google, they've banned Twitter. The Chinese equivalent is closely monitored. And in fact, when a Chinese language blogger in the US once called for a jasmine revolution in China, the Chinese promptly blocked all searches for the word jasmine, even if you were looking for jasmine tea or the Disney princess. So there are, I mean, obviously sort of gatekeepers who fight back in some societies, but the fact is that, of course, there are other societies too where we wish sometimes that gatekeepers existed. There was, for example, an almost surreal panic perpetrated by hackers this week in which somebody hacked the Associated Press site, tweeted that there had been explosions in the White House and President Obama had been injured or missing, and there was immediately a computer-generated panic selling in the market that wiped off $134 billion off the US stock exchanges, right, just because of a hacking on Twitter. So you have to worry about the total absence, in a sense, of gatekeepers in all of these. And this is just an algorithm that kicked in on these